Ascent Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Everyday Freedom, Designing the Framework for a Flourishing Society, by Philip K. Howard. Narrated by Bill Thatcher. Introduction. For 25 years, Ken Wagner had a front-row seat to challenges in public schools, first as a teacher in New York, and then as Commissioner of Education in Rhode Island. Wagner, now retired from public service, sums up school failures as a plague of powerlessness. In Rhode Island, he had to help pick up the pieces when the young and talented Providence school superintendent quit because he lacked authority to do the job. The sixth superintendent in Providence to leave in 20 years. The enemy is the system, Wagner concluded. New teachers come into schools like candles. Then the system starts snuffing them out. Wagner gives a litany. Follow the lesson plan. Focus on standardized tests. No exceptions for that student. No, we can't fix the water leak. Prove in a legal hearing that the student was disruptive. Ignore the parents. Don't even think about being creative. Stay within the boundaries of the union contract. After 5 or 10 years, many teachers have had their spirits squeezed out of them. What's left are a few heroes in an impossible system. Now compare Wagner's experience in schools with a diagnosis by Dr. Jesse Ehrenfeld, president of the American Medical Association, about the plague of physician burnout. Dr. Ehrenfeld describes systemic issues in our healthcare system that have long been ignored, ever-growing administrative burdens that take us away from time with our patients, poorly functioning electronic health records, a pervasive sense of being powerless to fix the problems we encounter. Now move over to careers within government. A sense of futility is the common complaint among public employees, as if they're swimming in a vast bureaucratic riptide. Many public employees learn they can't make a difference, a senior civil servant in Florida told me, so they give up. This is one reason why recruiting new public employees is proving so difficult. Now let's look at American culture. Something basic is missing. Americans know it. Nothing much works as it should. Simple daily choices seem fraught with peril. In the workplace, we walk on eggshells. Big projects, say modernizing infrastructure, get stalled in years of review. Endemic social problems such as homelessness become, well, more endemic. Oh, there goes San Francisco. Doing what's right is not on the table. Who's to say what's right? Extremism grows. Powerlessness has become a defining feature of modern society. Americans at all levels of responsibility feel powerless to do what they think is needed. The culture wars, sociologist James Davison Hunter explains, stem from institutional impotence. A growing majority of Americans believe that their government cannot be trusted, that its leaders are incompetent and self-interested, and that as citizens they personally have little power to influence the institutions or circumstances that shape their lives. Feeling fragile and buffeted by forces beyond our control, many Americans retreat to online groups defined by identity and by distrust of the other side as a threat to our existence. It's hard to identify what's wrong amid the clamor and conflict in modern society, but a clue can be found in remembering what makes us proud. America is where people roll up our sleeves and get it done. The ability to do things in our own ways activates the values for which America is well known: self-reliance, pragmatism, and loyalty to the greater good, what Alexis de Tocqueville called self-interest rightly understood. For most of American history, the power and imperative to own your actions and solutions, the concept of individual responsibility, was implicit in the idea of freedom. Americans didn't abandon our belief in individual responsibility. It was taken away from us by a post-1960s legal framework that, with the best of intentions, made people squirm through the eye of a legal needle before taking responsibility. Individual responsibility to a broader group, for example, was dislodged by a new concept of individual rights focused on what's best for one person or constituency. The can-do culture became the can't-do culture. At every level of responsibility, Americans have lost the authority to do what they think is sensible. The teacher in the classroom, the principal in a school, the nurse in the hospital, the official in Washington, the parent on the field trip, the head of a local charity or church, all have their hands tied by real or feared legal constraints. For several decades, I've dissected the failures of government and discussed the need for simplified structures that allow government to accomplish its goals without stifling Americans' freedom. Leaders and intellectuals from both sides have embraced my diagnosis, but little has changed. America is apparently rich enough to endure continuing government ineptitude and waste. I now see that the greater danger is not ineffective government, but the corrosion of American culture. Alienation has become a plague. Many Americans no longer believe in America. That's largely because, I argue here, they no longer have the freedom to take responsibility in their daily choices. Persistent failures feed the frustration and seed a culture of distrust. Instead of focusing on how to make things work, Americans obsess about what might go wrong. The cure is not mainly new policies, but new legal operating structures that re-empower Americans in their everyday choices. People must have everyday freedom, by which I mean the individual authority at every level of society and every level of responsibility to act as they feel appropriate, constrained only by the boundaries of law and by norms set by the employer or other institution. People must be free to draw on their skills, intuitions, and values when confronting daily challenges. They must own their actions. It is this ownership of choices that gives freedom its power and makes it the source of pride. That's how things get done sensibly and fairly. In a crowded society, individual freedom also requires a framework for mutual trust. Here as well, everyday freedom is key to rebuilding a hierarchy of authority to protect against antisocial behavior. Restoring the authority to use judgment when applying law is as important for a judge and a public official as for a citizen. Indeed, I will argue that liberty in the broad sense requires judges and officials, when applying legal principles, to assert norms of reasonableness. Otherwise, self-interested people will use law to claim almost anything. Freedom is used in many ways, often to support contradictory positions and policies. Everyday freedom is not directed at policy goals, but is a philosophy of implementation and interaction. Letting people use their judgment when fulfilling responsibilities should be a goal of both progressives and conservatives. It's the only way to deliver good government. By empowering individuals to do what they think is sensible and right, it's also the only way to pull America out of the downward spiral of worsening failure, distrust, and alienation. What should overhaul look like? I propose a new legal framework that replaces red tape and self-interested rights with individual responsibility and accountability. Instead of purging authority to prevent abuse, this framework rebuilds clear lines of authority to make common choices, to oversee those choices, and to define zones of protected freedom. 1. The human need to do things our own way. Humans need agency. Waking up in the morning, most people want to make a difference in their jobs, families, or communities. Liberty to pursue our own goals is how most people probably conceive of freedom. But that's only one aspect of freedom. People also need freedom in how we do things. Individual liberty is individual power, the capacity to act to achieve one's ends. Historian Eric Foner wrote in The Story of American Freedom, quoting John Quincy Adams, "Making things happen is a powerful driver of individual energy and creativity. Pride and self-respect flow from our choices on how to carry out projects, on what we decide is fair and sensible, and on how we work with others to achieve things bigger than ourselves. Think of all the activities and accomplishments that you are proud of, whether in your career, your community, or your family. All happened in part because of your individual effort and ideas. Personal ownership of daily choices is the main way we express our commitment and character. For most of human history, social struggles were aimed at big freedoms, replacing tyrants with democratic governance and achieving equal rights for women and minorities. The freedom of people in daily activities was taken for granted. Printers, cobblers, and silversmiths, for example, had the pride of their craft. Farmers had the pride of hard work on land they knew. Healthy organizations such as companies and universities had an internal culture with definite norms that people could rely upon. Many communities throbbed with joint activities, such as running the school, providing social services, and organizing little leagues or holiday parades. Starting in the 1960s, the social and legal institutions of America were remade to try to eliminate unfair choices by people in positions of responsibility. The new legal structures reflected a deep distrust of human authority in even its more benign forms. A teacher's authority in the classroom, or a manager's judgments about who's doing the job, or a university president's authority to enforce norms of civil discourse. Individual responsibility was replaced by red tape and legal process. The goal was to enhance freedom by reducing any wiggle room for bias, unfairness, or error. The immediate effect was to remove the freedom to act on our best judgment. For example, teachers regurgitate mandatory lesson plans and are powerless to deal with disruptive students. Another effect is a sense of repression, fueling the alienation against traditional institutions and social norms. Spontaneity in the workplace is suppressed, and free speech on campus is replaced by politically correct speech codes. Selfishness has filled the vacuum left by the loss of institutional authority, further eroding freedom. Centralized law and regulation aimed at compliance and conformity have hollowed out community institutions and discouraged local initiative. Deprived of opportunities to do things your way and to join with others to make a difference, many people withdraw into pockets of resistance and lay blame on the other. The land of opportunity has become the land of distrust. Suppressing daily freedoms causes many people to give up. Tocqueville feared that democracy, in a quest for equality, might mandate conformity in daily life. Extending state control to daily decisions, he thought, would kill the American spirit. It is especially dangerous to enslave men in the minor details of life. For my own part, I should be inclined to think freedom less necessary in great things than in little ones. Subjection in minor affairs does not drive men to resistance, but it crosses them at every turn, till they are led to surrender the exercise of their own will. Thus their spirit is gradually broken, and their character enervated. Modern law didn't mean to suffocate the human spirit, it just meant to preclude unfairness. But, as I discuss now, people can't be programmed like a computer. Most decisions are not even the result of conscious reasoning. Human intelligence resides largely in the unconscious part of the brain. Most achievement requires adaptation on the spot, nor can social relations be programmed. Human perception can be repressed, but not canceled. We see what we see. 2. Everyday freedom is essential for achievement. Human choice on the spot is indispensable to the success of most activities. Achievement generally hinges in large part on the judgment, skill, energy, and values of the people involved, the mother, the doctor, the repairman, the foreman, and others. Management theorist Chester Barnard thought that 9/10 of all organization activity is on the responsibility, the authority, of those who make the last contributions, who apply personal energies to the final concrete objectives. Organizational tools and protocols only take us so far. People must apply themselves to finish the job. Even repetitious activities, such as assembly lines, require human oversight and adjustment. The power of artificial intelligence is an advancing frontier with limits yet to be discovered. AI tools are likely to significantly enhance the power and productivity of individuals, but many experts believe that AI cannot be left alone. AI is a black box, without reliable constraints of social norms and without empathy. Everyday freedom is also relevant to social policy because it enables officials as well as citizens to do what's needed to meet public goals. Teachers in the classroom, cops on the beat, supervisors in the workplace, inspectors for public agencies, work crews on the roads, officials in charge of public permits, all need the freedom to make sense of the situations confronting them. Most failures of government cannot fairly be pinned on excessive regulatory goals. They're failures of execution. Lousy schools, unaccountable cops, decade-long permitting, inefficient and unresponsive public services that, as I will discuss, stem directly or indirectly from the powerlessness of public employees on the ground. Partisans on both sides argue about policy goals, but neither side presents a vision of how better to run the operations of government. What's lost in our time are the microeconomic truths of how humans and institutions achieve things. Daily achievements of most people consist of many small and large choices. The freedom to make these daily choices is the essential mechanism by which anything good happens. Everyday freedom unleashes human capabilities in two vital ways. First, as noted, everyday freedom liberates people to take ownership for how things happen. These choices invariably involve uncertainty, risk of failure, and often moral judgments about right and wrong. Personal ownership of those choices is what energizes people and engages their creativity. The freedom to interact spontaneously with others is also a condition of healthy relationships and mutual trust, and, Hannah Arendt thought, is the most elementary manifestation of human freedom. Everyday freedom is also indispensable because not much gets done, at least not sensibly, unless people can act on their perceptions, intuitions, and values. This is for cognitive reasons. People lack the capacity to rely on reason or logic to adapt, innovate, or interact effectively. The elements of effective action predominantly come from the unconscious part of the brain, not the conscious part. Our perception and intuitions, developed by training and experience, are melded together in that deep unconscious and emerge as action or a presumption of what to do. In repetitious tasks, action flows spontaneously from the unconscious, barely waving at our conscious brain as it emerges from a person as speech or decisions. In The Mind at Work, Mike Rose describes how waiters, carpenters, plumbers, and others disappear into the task. Their judgment is reflected in their actions, not conscious thought. Our knowledge is in our action. Sully Sullenberger, the pilot of the airliner that lost its power shortly after takeoff in New York, drew on his instincts to maintain a downward trajectory sufficient to maintain airspeed long enough to safely ditch the plane in the Hudson River. As William Longevisha described in Fly-by-Wire, Sullenberger did not sit in airplanes so much as put them on. He flew them in a profoundly integrated way, as an expression of himself. Sullenberger's own recollection of the last seconds before hitting the river revealed the power of intuition. The earth and the river were rushing toward us. At that instant, I judged it was the right time. I pulled the sidestick back, farther back, finally full aft, and held it there as we touched the water. Self-consciousness, making people think through their actions, will often cause failure when people are accessing muscle memory or reacting to immediate situations. A pianist cannot play the piece, chemist and philosopher Michael Polanyi observes in Personal Knowledge, if she thinks about how she is hitting the notes. For activities that involve sensory or personal taste, studies suggest that people make worse judgments when they know they must justify them. In his essay, The Emotional Dog and Its Rational Tail, social psychologist Jonathan Haidt explains how moral choices and decisions about right conduct also emerge almost spontaneously from the unconscious. But human decision-making is flawed in predictable ways, as Daniel Kahneman and others have shown. For example, people tend to avoid potential losses more than they value potential gains. There is an enormous body of psychological study about the relative strengths of intuitive choices, known as System 1, and reflective reasoning, System 2. Pausing and getting input is wise for many strategic decisions, such as feedback from colleagues, friends, or from the public. Surveys and trials can provide valuable input before committing resources. A second approval, or rule-of-thumb protocols, can be useful to avoid mistakes. A rote checklist is vital in situations where a small error can result in disaster, such as a pilot forgetting to push a button before a plane takes off, or a surgeon operating on the wrong limb. Having gone through the checklist, however, the surgeon disappears into the task, largely guided by perception and experience. It is often said about effective people that they have good judgment, implying that they reason their way toward successful outcomes. But that's a rationalist delusion, Jonathan Haidt explains. Even where people are reflecting on what to do, the ultimate choice is usually an intuition that the person can't break down into parts. Michael Polanyi describes how people engage in the usual process of unconscious trial and error by which we feel our way to success without specifically knowing how we do it. In his essay, The Dog and the Frisbee, Andrew Haldane, former chief economist for the Bank of England, compares the instinctual foundation of monetary policy with the skill of a dog to catch frisbees. Scientific discovery, Polanyi believed, involves a kind of dialectic between intuitive and analytical skills, but intuitive powers are dominant and decisive. Only the final confirmation of a scientific discovery is a matter of objective proof. Conscious deliberation can act as a kind of filter to avoid rash decisions or to add inputs that inform decisions, although more often, Haidt explains, reasoning is used to rationalize intuitions. Even with deliberation and analysis, final judgments are still largely intuitive. Management theorist Peter Drucker observed that amazingly few people know how they get things done. Freedom doesn't guarantee success, of course. Failure is the main learning tool of progress, the process of trial and error. Consistently poor decisions or performance is one reason why accountability is critical. Each of us is better at some things than at others. Taking responsibility also reveals our sense of morality. Everyday freedom operates in a kind of marketplace in which people are free to make judgments about other people and to decide whether they want to deal with you or buy your products or services. People judging people is the currency of social interaction and cannot be expunged even if we wanted to. Like atoms in a test tube, people in a free society bounce here and there and form alliances with others. Teachers who don't succeed in one school can thrive in another. The unconscious aspects of human decision-making also incorporate unconscious biases. Law has a role to play in pushing against these biases, for example by banning discriminatory practices. Studies show that trying too hard to purge bias, on the other hand, has the paradoxical effect of reaffirming or causing bias. Successful relationships require candor and mutual respect, not a muzzle. It's not rocket science, former Rhode Island Education Commissioner Ken Wagner observed about good schools. Give everyone a sense of ownership, including students. Principals and teachers should have the freedom to do what's needed to engage students, including especially drawing on their personalities and passions. What's effective generally is what students think is interesting. Visit a school, and you can tell in 5 minutes whether teachers and students feel part of a learning culture. No legal framework can supplant the human perceptions and instincts needed to get things done. The power of daily choices by each individual is probably the most important resource of a free society. That belief in individual and institutional initiative, the power and pride of American culture, was smothered by the legal structure erected starting in the 1960s. 3. Law after the 1960s, replacing institutional authority with individual rights. The tumultuous decade of the 1960s was a reaction to serial abuses of authority, including segregation, pollution, gender discrimination, unsafe cars, Vietnam, and, in the early 1970s, Watergate. Changing law to reflect better social values was essential, but how could society protect against future abuses? Freedom was reconceived as a concept of individual rights against anyone with authority, instead of a concept of human agency, including for people with responsibility. There was a massive redefinition of freedom, historian Eric Foner found, as a rejection of all authority. The 1960s rights revolution transformed institutional choices. Government was the first domino to fall. Any public decision, including personnel choices, school discipline, and public contracts and permits, was not valid unless officials could demonstrate why their decision did not abuse their authority. Government decisions, law professor Charles Reich argued, should be considered the new property of each individual. Focusing on individual rights, he argued, was necessary because legislatures often have a simplistic notion of public interest that undermines the independence of the individual. If a public employee had rights against abuse of authority, why not private employees? The civil rights movement focused on protections against racial discrimination. Why not against discrimination of any sort? Any adverse personnel decision became legally suspect. Reich approved. It is not any particular power, but all kinds of power, that are to be feared. After the 1960s, the framework of American law was largely rebuilt, with 3 new legal mechanisms aimed at safeguarding against decisions by people with authority. 1. Prescriptive rule books, wherever possible, would dictate one correct way to do things. For forest rangers and national parks, volumes of detailed rules replaced the pamphlet that used to guide their activities. Safety in the workplace was regulated not by unsafe practices, but by thousands of rules, many self-evident, trivial, or overbearing, such as requirements to eliminate stairwells, maintain neat closets, and use industrial-grade hammers. Before the 1960s, there was no such thing as 1,000-page rulebooks. But at the turn of the 20th century, theorists such as Max Weber and Frederick Winslow Taylor thought that rigorous systems could dictate a fixed route of march without the need for human judgment, thereby avoiding the risk of human fallibility. Experts after the 1960s grabbed onto these theories like a life preserver. Only precise, specific guidelines, Brookings scholar Herbert Kaufman wrote, can assure common treatment of like cases. 2. For decisions that cannot be dictated in advance, formal procedures would force officials to provide proof of the correctness of their decisions. Proof of objective facts, the theory went, would resolve any dispute. The legal process movement was the brainchild of law professors Henry Hart and Albert Sachs, who argued that law should not provide final answers, but should be content-neutral and provide an agreeable procedure for getting acceptable answers. These procedures soon took on a life of their own. Giving a permit to modernize infrastructure or disciplining a public employee began to take years. 3. The new litmus test of individual rights empowered people to file a lawsuit for any adverse life event and to throw a legal monkey wrench into any decisions they disagreed with. Instead of being a protection against state power, these new rights let people invoke state power to address personal disappointments in the workplace or in schools. Almost any ordinary accident, say a fall on a playground, could be dressed up as an outrage with the benefit of hindsight. Why wasn't there better supervision of the kids at the swing set? But these rights had a common theme. They seemed to be selfishness dressed up in legal clothes, conclusions masquerading as reasons, in the words of legal scholar Cass Sunstein. Because the new legal framework embodied new values, including protections against racism, pollution, and unsafe cars, it enjoys a halo of virtue. But pulling down the hierarchy of authority was not the only or the best way to achieve those new values. I will shortly describe how these new legal mechanisms...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?